All right, Raven Tribe, we're here today with Hanjiro, one of the senior members and co-founders of the Raven Tribe. And we're going to talk today a little bit about Bushido and understanding what the concept of Bushido really is. It's something that a lot of us are familiar with, and we're going to look at some of the facts and maybe dispel some of the common misconceptions here about the concept. So, Hanjiro, thank you for joining us, and can you go ahead and give us a little bit of information about the concept of Bushido and how you understand it?
Hello. So we'll have to break this down into pieces and into specific parts within Bushido itself. So let's look at the word Bushido, said just like that, like Japanese say. Bushi meaning like to serve or a martial person. Bu meaning martial, shi person, do is way. So getting into translation work, once you look at a language and you need to translate it into another language, there's always going to be some disconnect. No language directly translates into another language unless it is already a part of that language. Good example is English and say French or Spanish or German, because French, Spanish, and German influenced English. Japanese was not influenced by English directly. Indirectly, it is, but English was not influenced by Japanese at all, just because of geography. One example that Japanese was influenced by a foreign language is they use three systems of writing. One of them is just for foreign words. So the Japanese think, we're not going to make another Japanese word for coffee, so they'll just say something like kohi. So they'll use the sounds within their language to make a word that sounds like an existing word from English, coffee. A really good one, which even most Japanese don't understand, is there's a specific type of pumpkin called what are they called? Kabocha. It's like they call it a hatchet squash, very hard skinned, very squat, but a lot of Japanese eat it. Kabocha. It's actually a corruption of a Portuguese pronunciation for Kampuchea. Kampuchea is the old kingdom of bordering Cambodia and Siam in Southeast Asia, where the Portuguese were, and that's where they brought the pumpkins to Japan from. They brought them with them. But when the Portuguese were explaining it, so the story goes, they said kabocha, or it was understood as kabocha instead of kampuchea, and that migrated into the Japanese language. This kind of thing happens with all languages, but the idea behind it is the Japanese they'd lost over time the understanding of where the word kabocha comes from. They didn't know that it was a geographic location of Kampuchea based upon that. Similarly, when we get into translations of Japanese into English, some people who don't know the language take things for granted and take truths for granted without questioning the reasoning behind it. And a great thing about Japanese is, even though there's no direct translation, it's pictograph, it's an ideogram. So when you look at the Chinese characters that the Japanese use for a lot of this stuff, you can get a good idea of where it comes from, when it was changed or when it was added, or who's telling the story. But in order to do that, you have to understand the language, and not like Google Translation or another person who says that they know. A person who has a really solid background, because even in Japan, even Japanese speakers, not a lot of them, maybe 50% of the older generation understand Chinese characters, which is the basis for what most older Japanese martial arts are documented in. So that's just the language, that's just the translation, that sets the understanding that we have misunderstandings. Now to get into the historical aspect of it. Bushido, used as a terminology, was mentioned in a couple of older historical texts. One of them is called Hagakure, written in kind of a farmland area around the 1600s. basically by a low-level samurai retainer or a person who worked for a samurai or a samurai themselves. There's some question as to that directly. So it's difficult to know who and exactly when, but it is documented that exact term. It has shown up since then, but it became very, very popular as an ideal or a guiding force for your life or a principle to follow kind of thing in the 1800s with the Meiji government, or the government that came out of the governmental revolution from old style Japanese military government when the United States, or the black ships as they called them under William Perry, entered into harbor and basically opened up Japan around the 1880s, 1860s, I think. I'm sorry, my history is bad on that one. When that happened, Japan had a political convulsion. They realized we're going to be opened up to the world, and the emperor changed his influence, the government changed its position and format. Military generals came in and they became stylized after the Western military system. And so to do that, you had a country that went from being small warring states to one unified government that had to produce a standing army. And everybody from Lycurgus, the person who founded the laws supposedly of Sparta, all the way up to Napoleon, understood that militaries have to have a centralized doctrine in order to direct them. The Japanese used something called Bushido, which was not something during the warring states or the time before 1800, which was codified for all samurai in all places. That did not exist. This was a new thing that they were going to use old ideas and old military practices from different places and put it all together and kind of come up with one homogenized term and one homogenized way of doing, and put that towards the military, hence Bushido. So they basically came up with this almost romanticized idea of the samurai and the old ways, and they said, this is the ideal soldier, will be a person that puts military or emperor first. That ideal was actually started under the Tokugawa, or the military dictatorship of the 1700s, which was the first almost unifying power of Japan. Same idea, that military dictatorship or that military government said, we need people to have loyalty to the military ruler first. So they instituted this idea that they took martial codes and they said, first and foremost, duty to the military dictator or the military ruler, the daimyo, first, and you pay with your life. Your loyalty is to death. Historically, that was not the case. From Buddhist and Shinto schools to martial schools before that time, and then later on, before the 1800s, loyalty was to your parents, for they were the ones who brought you into this world. And then was loyalty to your teachers, loyalty to your masters, loyalty to government, and that kind of stuff. But the military dictatorship or the military government of the 1700s, and then later on, the military changeover to the Meiji government of the 1800s, used this idea of loyalty and direction to put people on the path to loyalty towards, first, in the 1700s, a military dictatorship or government. In the 1800s, the new Meiji government is how I will state it, and I'll continue to refer to it in that way. So that's where the term got started in common practice, Bushido, and used the way that we understand it now. Beforehand, like I said, even back to the 1600s, the term was used, but it was used in different ways. And that's a whole other podcast in and of itself to explain that. So Bushido, how we have it now, has its modern roots in the Meiji government of the 1880 changeover to a modern Western-style military government, but with a quote-unquote Japanese spirit at the center of it, which comes from Bushido. Now, the components of Bushido as it was explained by the Meiji government, was one, loyalty towards the emperor and the government, two, cultivation of yourself and your spirit for those ends. And then after that came a bunch of other stuff that, again, would be another podcast. So I hope that explains a little bit of translation errors, things of cultural differences, and some of the historical background, but pinpointing to the Meiji government of the 1880 changeover from old-style feudal government to a new government, and where they needed to use Bushido as a spiritual and focusing coalescence of terms in order to get a military to follow a centralized doctrine to move towards a modern age. I know that's kind of a lot of difficult terminology and a very dense explanation of things, but there's a lot to unpack in that. And for every individual school, there will be changes. For the Okinawan schools, for the Japanese schools, for the sport fighting systems, for a lot of these things change. But that's our modern anchoring point right there. As far as places to look and find resources on Bushido, you can go to historical texts, but they're going to predate the 1880 changeover toward military government, toward the Meiji government, and that will change the terminology. So that'll change the lens at which you're looking at it. If you go after the fact, so say there was a famous author, this guy Yukio Mishima. Mishima was a nationalist. He believed in Japanese nationalism, and it was post-World War II that he was really upset with the Western powers really changing Japan and, quote, suppressing the military and martial culture of Japan. So, and I believe it was 1974, he broke into a, quote-unquote, self-defense building, or it'd be like a National Guard of Japan. He broke into one of their buildings and with a bunch of people read out this proclamation that the Western powers had weakened Japan's spirit and transformed it into a puppet state, and then proceeded to have a guy, he was going to commit the ritual suicide, put the knife in his belly, cut it across, and then have a person standing behind him and cut off his head. The gruesome facts, and there's a lot of it, and I don't want to get into it, was he was a nationalist, and he believed in a code of Bushido. And that was the same thing that was propagated by the government of the 1800s, and it was kept alive by nationalists after World War II, when the United States banned the wearing, or the use of swords and the practicing of some martial arts, and really the U.S. didn't want Japan's nationalism to flare up again. But there were some people that kept it alive. Some people changed their understanding of the Bushido code then, after World War II, so that it wasn't so nationalistic, and then some people kept it alive in that way, kind of like Mishima, because he practiced kendo and he practiced iaido and using sword and karate and that kind of stuff. But then he was, practicing weightlifting and Western boxing and that kind of stuff. So he took the best of East and West, but he kept what he called the Japanese Yamato Kokoro, means the Japanese heart and the Japanese spirit. And then he did what he did. He did that as a protest, and it was very bad. There's video of it, I guess, somebody, watching this poor guy getting hacked to death, because unfortunately he chose a kid who'd never cut through a corpse before, to try and cut off his head, and it took a few whacks, and it was horrible and gross, but he was willing to pay the ultimate price for his understanding of Bushido. And that's one way. And now we have further ideas of what Bushido is that's based upon everybody's idea, and everybody's idea is influenced by a bunch of things, but one of them that could be totally easily understood is understanding of language and culture and where it comes from. And that's pretty much it. Other than that, Bushido is a very changeable idea, but if you were to take the actual characters and you can look them up, even they will be different from how it was originally written in the earlier codes of the samurai. And then understand, it's not the code of the samurai. It's a code of conduct for following the martial way. It wasn't something that everybody did. And it was different for every person. And it was manipulated and changed by different people for different ends. Military dictatorships in the 1700s, changeovers to a national government in the 1800s, all the way up to a guy in the 1970s who was protesting against the influence of other governments. So you can see where the term becomes very changeable. And I give everyone listening to this a challenge to always keep an open mind and do their research, but keep an open mind and keep what they call shinmenkan. Shinmenkan is like keeping a central mind, or keeping your mind in one place, in the middle, and understand the left and the right without going too far to the left or to the right, so you don't get warped in that way. And then hopefully you won't get so messed up that you do something like break into a National Guard armory and kill yourself in protest, and do it in a very gruesome way. Other than that, that's all that I can impart on that without becoming preachy and dogmatic. But if anybody wants to, you can put on the robes and do it yourself. But become a cult and be weird. Try not to do that. Any other questions about Bushido, or what's specific stuff that you wanted to cover?
Well, do you have any opinions or thoughts on how modern American martial artists have adopted Bushido as this kind of romanticized way of the warrior code? How far off are they from what Bushido was in its inception to the way they are practicing it now in dojos across America?
Well, it's two things. So we'll only limit this because that's a very big question. Again, just like the other one, I don't want to spend 10 minutes on that. Everybody's probably pissed off that I took too much time already. So, two things. One, it's an interpretation, just like we talked about. So it's going to be different. That's how it is. Two, it may be an interpretation that is not being followed by the entirety of the person's being. Bushido, no matter who was using the term, the one thing that is constant was that it was supposed to completely encompass your entire life. Just like the Buddhists say, it's proper speech, looking things in a proper way, hearing things in a proper way, doing things in a proper way, and influencing all things around you in the right way. So that means like seeing things clearly, hearing things clearly, not being incorrect in that, and then doing things that are helpful to other people and to yourself, and not being evil, for lack of a better word, that kind of stuff. That was supposed to be something that was a part of everybody's translation or usage of Bushido. Everything that I talked about before, that's one thing that was a part of it. And I don't see that being done in modern martial arts. It's like we don't walk around in a gi, or, like I don't walk around with sword and Japanese clothing all the time, but you keep your mind in that sense so that the things that you train in school are things that affect your entire life. So it's the same idea with Bushido. And modern guys are not practicing in that way where it affects their entire life. They affect their everyday, all day with the mind of Bushido, or the mind of Shinmen Shinkan, or with Mushin, all these different Japanese terms. That's the first. The second would be back to what we talked about. Everybody has a different way of doing things, and that is actually closer to the original intent. Was Bushido was very personal. Other than making sure that it was something that affected your whole life every day, it was something that was personal. But like the term samurai comes from the Japanese word sabureru, which means to serve. So the samurai were essentially supposed to be very strong and everything else, but they were in the service of other people. And Bushido comes from the samurai, so it's supposed to be the code of service for other people. So that's where that relates to day in and day out, and normal practice and everyday practice.
Okay, tribe. So I want to thank Hanjiro for sharing some information with us here today, and we will be following up with him with a series of interviews addressing a lot of the common misconceptions about historical martial arts. So stay tuned, and we'll be back soon with some more information for you. Thank you.